Ricardo Alarcon de Quesada fought against the dictatorship of Batista, and after the revolution triumph, he worked for many years in the first line of the political battle, as a diplomat, a politician, and for many years as the president of the National Assembly of the People's Power. We visited him in his office to know how and why the Cuban Revolution survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we also asked him about the challenges of the democracy in this country. The media of the late 80s and the beginnings of the 90s repeated a lot the idea that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cuban Revolution was ended. As a matter of fact, it was also a bet of a lot of American politicians that thought that Cuban Revolution was over, and they reinforced a lot of laws and created new ones to actually see the blockade stronger than ever. But the revolution did not end, and I would like a reflection about this of you, your opinion.
Because the Cuban Revolution was not an offshoot of the October Revolution or the European Socialist camp. That's why, a while ago, I was emphasizing to you about the independence of Cuba as a key circumstance that was fully recognized by the Soviets. It is a problem with history some Americans have. Too much of a problem, unfortunately. As they carried out their anti-Cuban campaigns, among other things, describing us as puppets of the Soviet Union, logically, if the puppeteer falls, the puppets will fall also. But as that was not the case, it didn't happen. And I remember that during the Torricelli bill, someone in the House floor criticized it because it would harm U.S. relations with third countries. Essentially, the Torricelli bill was adding the trade ban between Cuba and U.S. subsidiaries in third countries. And Torricelli answered, it doesn't matter. Next year, this law will not be necessary because there will not be a revolutionary government in Cuba anymore. Those were his words, roughly. And we heard the same story from Helms 4 years later. They were absolutely convinced about that. They have taken their time until 2014 to realize what everybody knew, that Cuba is an independent country and not part of the United States, and has its own history, and also that the attempt to isolate it and make it go away had failed. The announcement came on December the 17th, and more recently the two flags were hoisted. There's something I told a person who asked me. When the American flag was hoisted in Havana, it didn't mean the U.S. was starting a new era in the Americas, but doing what all the other countries, without exceptions, had done before. The American flag was hoisted in a capital where, for a long time, each and all the flags of each and all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have been flying, besides Canada. I don't think there are many capitals where even the smallest island in the Caribbean has its representation. And Havana is also the only city on earth where, besides all that, there is also a mission representing the Puerto Rican people. It is run by the patriotic movement, but I frequently visit that mission and meet people there. And I have met annexionist, autonomist, and all kinds of leaders. For the Puerto Ricans, it is their embassy, their representation. Perhaps because of the fact that due to the colonial status of Puerto Rico, they cannot fly the Puerto Rican colors anywhere on the island, alone, but together with the U.S. flag. The only place where they can fly the Puerto Rican flag is here in Havana. So actually, it took the U.S. a long time and much effort to realize what was happening before its eyes, that its Cuba isolation policy had failed thunderously. Incidentally, I did like Secretary Kerry's reference to democracy. Apart from his intentions and so on, because there is also something which I believe should be remembered now, morally speaking, and it is that to isolate Cuba, the United States crushed democracy in Latin America. Eventually, in 1964, it managed that all countries, with the exception of Mexico, yielded to that policy and they severed relations. But to do it, they had to depose President Goulart in Brazil and impose a fascist dictatorship that was followed by others. That's the reality of the 60s. Latin American democracies fell one after the other and were replaced by the worst tyrannies because the U.S. wanted to have obedient governments which joined the effort to isolate, block, and destroy Cuba. That's what happened. The U.S. returned with its flag. Is a very important democratic event. Finally, they have decided to join the position of not the majority, but of all the other countries without exception.
When you were the president of the parliament, from a moment in time, we saw you a lot leading a political fight for the returning of the Cuban Five who were imprisoned in the U.S. after manipulated trials.
Once I was talking with the leader of the revolution about how complex that issue was, and he assigned me that task. And for a long time, I've got used to following his instructions.
Una historia que felizmente para ellos y para el pueblo cubano.
That was a story that ended happily. They are free now. There are a lot of smiles and spirit of victory. But the story of the Cuban Five had a cost, a high cost, and a lot of suffering from the families and the Cuban people. You talked about the Cuban Five so intensely during those years. So intensely that I would say you left the diplomat behind. You lived also the past. You lived the dictatorship during the Batista years. You lived the aggression of the Bay of Pigs battle. You made history as part of the group of diplomats that were in the U.S. during the Carter years. You know this conflict between Cuba and the United States very well, and you suffered that as a diplomat, as a Cuban. And I would like your opinion about what's going on now, about the reestablishing of diplomatic relations, about the future with the United States. How do you make peace with a country that has made such a deep mark in our history, in the Cuban history?
That's really a big question. Look, I think it should be understood we are now in a phase when there is work towards what is called a normalization of diplomatic relations. That has nothing to do with friendship, cooperation, or even good neighborhood. The U.S. is having normal diplomatic relations with countries, and it is even bugging the personal cell phones of their heads of state. Was the U.S. having normal diplomatic relations with Cuba before the triumph of the revolution? Just read the memoirs by Ambassador Smith, The Third Floor, where he admits that after Batista, he was man number 2 in Cuba. You may be generous. And Cuba, after all, was generous by accepting the resumption of formal diplomatic relations when there are the blockade and the Guantanamo base, and also a policy which has not been changed, or at least they haven't said they will change it, a policy of subversion, of changing the regime, as they say. I think it was a wise and smart move by President Raúl Castro and the government of Cuba. Why? Because it might lead, as it is leading to a process in which those other big hurdles would be surmounted. That will take time and it will be complicated. Let's hope such a point is reached during the present Obama administration, but it is very difficult to expect that this Congress will give Obama the approval for a full lifting of the blockade. But maybe one thing is taken out here, another there, and progress will be made in that direction. It is also very difficult to expect that a future administration can reverse the progress attained so far. Still, it is quite possible that they stop, stagnate, and complicate that process. But as to that, I disagree with some U.S. politicians. I believe history is very important. The past is important. But I even choose to think in terms of the future. We can normalize diplomatic relations. We can have them as before and so on. But don't you forget, we would continue being an island about which Thomas Jefferson, possibly one of the most brilliant figures among the generation of the so-called U.S. founding fathers, upon leaving the presidency in 1805, in a written message to the new president, he said that one of the things he regretted most was not being able to make Cuba part of the then nascent United States. Don't you forget that the Floridas at the time were not part of the American 13 colonies. They were still Spanish territories. So forget about that little story that all U.S. policies are the result of the views and attitudes of some groups in Florida. Before Florida became U.S. territory, Thomas Jefferson anticipated that Cuba should belong to the U.S., perhaps without having Florida. And he said something more, that he knew of no case in history of a small island so close to a big and powerful country which could embark on an independent path. Such ideas or notions have been subconsciously in U.S. politics for over 2 centuries. The day will come, we will have normal relations, diplomatic, trade, and economic relations between Cuba and the United States. But we shall continue being a small island, and we will continue being very close to a big country. And it is also a big country, and that's why I like that mention of democracy I alluded to earlier, which has a long way to go to stop being what it is, a source of threats and perils for the rest of the world. We, Cuba as a nation, as a people and government, and in our diplomacy, have consistently rejected interference, the pretense to dictate our destiny from outside, or discussing or negotiating with anybody our political, economic, social, or other projects. But actually, and speaking in full candor to you, the whole world has a right to be concerned about U.S. domestic affairs. Who can assure me that, notwithstanding these agreements, or in year 2016, 2020, or 2024, power will not be grabbed by those who are hunting blacks in the streets with impunity, or by those barbarians who discriminate women, or who are pretending that Mexico erects the wall so that Mexicans or Central Americans cannot enter the U.S. I mean, the danger posed by the evolution of U.S. domestic politics gives the whole world the right to be concerned about or have an interest in how things will go in the United States. Cuba would never pose a threat to the United States, but the U.S. has always been so. The great challenge for Cuba, in my judgment, goes beyond immediate things. I think that, yes, they will lift the blockade, or they will dismantle it gradually. I believe, and maybe it will come first, the Cuban travel ban will be lifted right away, or as President Obama has been trying to do it, that is, by giving licenses and so on. And I think we would come more or less to having more or less normal relations, as normal, I always say, quote unquote, as those the U.S. has with other countries. But that shall never change the fact that we are a small island with a zeal for its independence and for doing things as it decides, as a right every sovereign people have. And as they won't move to another planet, nor will we will stay very close to a big power which by itself poses a threat to humanity. I'm not saying he's thinking of this administration or some politicians, but of the forces you see acting inside that country.
Yo quisiera una reflexión suya.
I would like your opinion about Cuba, not United States, even though our country is deeply related to the conflict with the United States. But you had a very important position during some years, a lot of years. You were the president of the Cuban National Assembly of the People's Power, our parliament, the Cuban parliament. There is a debate about the challenges of the future of Cuba. Very important debate, and I would say that has nothing to do with the visit of the State Secretary John Kerry, whatever the international press says about this. I want your opinion about this debate about the future. How do you think the Cuban democracy should improve in a near context in which the historic leadership, the revolution, won't lead the government anymore? How do you see, as being a man that knows the international field and also the internal, the domestic field in this area, how do you see the future, and what would you recommend it to change to see our democracy improved?
Well, I could say that by enforcing the Constitution and the laws, by really enforcing them. Everything is defined in the people's power system, but it must be said also that practical enforcement has met huge resistance before the introduction of the recent changes in the Cuban economy and before this rapprochement with the United States. During my terms as Speaker of the National Assembly, one of the things I enjoyed most was to go and attend as an observer, really, neighborhood accountability assemblies with the neighbors. We have no time here for me to tell you about the many times I saw how a poor delegate had to complain in front of his voters about the absence at the meeting of one, two, three, or all the administrative officials responsible for things that were to be discussed there. What does that mean? That a manager of that grocery or pharmacy or a ministerial official in that area don't think that the highest authority there is the constituency delegate, because he was elected by the people. He's the true representative of the people. And in a real democracy, the sovereign are the people. Or Rousseau explained that democracy was an utopia, that a democratic and representative system could not exist because you cannot delegate sovereignty. A citizen is free the day he casts his vote and chooses the one he wants to represent him, but the next day he is the same slave he was before. So said Rousseau, referring to the British system, which was the only democracy, though it was a democracy then. The only way to do it is first to have a regime of social justice, of social and economic equality, together with a system under which a voter can control the elected official through what Rousseau called the imperative mandate. That is, people themselves will decide what their representative must do. But it turns out that administrators and bureaucrats do not believe in it, that it is nonsense, and what matters is the power they have, because they are the ones with cars in the neighborhood, with phones and resources, not in the hands of citizens who, so it seems, are just poor souls who are complaining, and that is not true. They are the sovereign exercising the authority. That's how the theory goes, and that's the letter of our laws. But we've got to admit that's not the reality. Everybody knows it. I think the challenge now is even greater, because I believe in normalization. I think it is possible to have two countries which overcome their antagonism and confrontation and so on, and that's good for the peoples of the two countries, correct. But I also believe that we must uphold democracy, regardless what it means for former Senator Kerry. I think it is something to be upheld in Cuba and in the United States. And the Cuban system, with all its imperfections, is much closer to achieving what could be that democratic utopia than the U.S. system. It is closer due to the progress made in terms of social justice in this country, in terms of equality and human solidarity. But all those factors are being strained today by capitalist elements which inevitably had to be introduced in Cuban society, like the personnel gain on others' work. That's the private property activity in this country which you can have in any other country. I don't think it should be eliminated, on the contrary, but it poses a bigger challenge as to the strengthening of a system which must be based on the leading roles of people, so that they control and exercise their sovereign rights on those they have elected and on the enterprises and institutions under their jurisdiction. That's true democracy. Those ideas are stated, not exactly in those words, in the documents on which our political system is based. But we've got to admit that even though we solved the biggest problems, that is, ending foreign domination, eradicating illiteracy, ending the worst forms of exploitation and large landholding, and so on and so forth. Well, that's true. But still, those are just the premises for the creation of a truly democratic regime. Besides, it must be understood also, so that this is not one-sided self-criticism, that our system did not develop under ideal conditions, but under the pressure, the stress, and the threat resulting from the permanent confrontation with the United States. If this confrontation sails into more civilized and quiet waters, we should avail ourselves of that, not to imitate a country that has little good things to imitate, but to strengthen our system and develop it for real and authentically, and give people the role they should play in a democracy, which is not. Well, now that we are among journalists, I remember Walter Lippmann, who was a great American liberal philosopher and journalist. He defined U.S. liberal democracy as a theater where the citizen is sitting in the last row as a spectator who can barely discern what's happening on stage, can't hear the voices and so on, but that's his role. He's the spectator. He should look at what others are doing, deciding, and executing. Democracy is just the opposite. There are no spectators, but protagonists. This is easy to say, but to achieve that, you need social transformations first, real independence, and a willingness to do that. The first requirement is to really believe in it, to be sure about it, and give the people what is theirs. It is given back to the people what belongs to them, so that a system can really claim to be democratic.
Thank you very much, Alarcon. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.